let me tell you a little bit about myself first. And I will say, I will give the caveat that, of course, the beginning part of my talk will be the challenging aspect of it. And so I will apologize for that ahead of time. But that challenging aspect is what my journey is about. So I will just get through it as best I can and bear with me. But a little bit about who I am and why I am who I am. I was born the second of 9 children in rural Northeast Texas. My father was probably the most significant influence in my life. He was the stable and motivating factor for me. He was a veterinarian by profession, community and religious leader and healer. I was raised in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, which most people know as the Mormons. And he was in the small congregation that was in the town that I lived in. He was essentially the leader in that area. And he was the most spiritual and intuitive, and now with the language that I would use today, the most psychic and clairvoyant person that I knew. He saw spirit with his waking eyes many times throughout his life. Often he would see people at their own funerals and in many other circumstances. So I do have that, those stories that he would tell, and he was very open about the things that he would see. I was a very artsy, creative, dreamy kid. I spent a lot of time in my own dream world. I wandered around the woods and the fields, and I spent a lot of time with my animals. I spent time drawing and painting when I was younger, and I became heavily involved in things like theater and music as I got older. I was essentially a good kid. I tried to be a rule follower. I wanted my parents to be proud of me. Guilt was a really good psychological motivator for me. And I also had a lot of spiritual and extrasensory experiences throughout my early and adult life, young adult life. I generally couched them in the religious language that I had for them at the time, or I chalked them up to coincidence or imagination, and I understood them based on my perspective at the time. I was a good student as a kid, and I left high school a year early to attend Brigham Young University, which is where young Mormon kids with good grades went to college. I met and married my husband, John, of 35 years. We're still together all this time at BYU. We had 3 children, 2 daughters and a son. I was a stay-at-home mom until all my kids were in school, at which time I went back to school myself and completed my BFA in art education and began teaching high school art, at which time I also completed my master's also in art education. And that story was my identity. That's who I was. I was a daughter, I was a mother, I was a wife, I was a teacher, I was all of those things I had raised and been, had been raised and grown up to be. That's how I identified myself. And I was very much put together by that identity. And of course, this story very much has to do with my son, Todd. In 2011, we moved to Baldwinsville, New York, and that summer of 2011, and it was just before Todd's junior year of high school. We got him enrolled in the school there. They told him that he had enough credits that he could graduate a year early if he wanted to. In fact, it's funny, I graduated early from high school. Actually, I didn't even graduate early. I just got accepted to college early. All 3 of my children graduated from high school early. There's something about flying the coop early in my family. And even though it was not necessarily planned, Todd was able to graduate early. And so he did. And he had a semester off before he would be taking classes at a local junior college while he was making his plans for higher education. And he was also considering the military. His sisters had joined the military, and he kind of had watched them do that. He was considering it, and we supported him no matter what he wanted to do. He was a good kid. He was a smart kid. He had a good head on his shoulders. We weren't worried about him. He never gave us a reason to worry. He was sweet. He was introverted. He would do anything you asked of him. And again, he never gave us a reason to worry. I had plans to open a new teaching studio and art gallery, and was getting ready to sign a lease. But on September the 19th, 2012, our world changed in the most profound and unimaginable way. Todd had gone job hunting that morning, and I knew he was in a bad mood, but it was nothing startling for a 17-year-old boy who'd gone out job hunting without much luck. I tried to help him put together a resume, and we spent a good part of the day together. Eventually, I left to run errands. My husband, John, and I arrived home at the same time and found Todd on his bedroom floor. My first thought was that he had fallen and hit his head. The thought that he could have harmed himself was the furthest possible scenario in my mind. We took Todd's body home to my family's farm in Marshall, Texas, and buried him in a small family cemetery that, and I apologize, this story still brings tears. We buried him in a small family cemetery that at the time only held the remains of my infant nephew, Andrew, my sister's son. The entire event was mostly a blur. Almost all the decisions were made by family members, and I was grateful. I was. My husband and I were holding on by a thread at the time. The impact for me was really an instant dark night of the soul. It really was. I couldn't eat, I couldn't sleep, I could barely get out of bed and get dressed. The world seemed suddenly very surreal. I couldn't fathom that the world was still moving. The sun was coming up and people were going to work. My husband, John, had to go back to work within a short period of time. And in the way that men do, he was at least able to compartmentalize portions of his day. His grief and suffering were every bit as real as my own, but he handled it differently. He bottled it up, and unfortunately, it impacted his health in very negative ways. I, on the other hand, was sitting in an empty house all day where my son had ended his physical life. And I was undergoing an ego death. All of the identities that had structured my sense of self collapsed and died with my son. Everything that I thought was real was suddenly suspect. And all I could feel was intense and unrelenting grief and guilt at having somehow failed to protect my son. I leaned heavily on my husband, who I tried in my feeble and inadequate ways to support and return. I quickly looked for outside help as well. Support groups, therapists, books on grief and suicide. And while those things helped me see that I was not alone in my experience, they failed to address the existential crisis that I was experiencing. And all of those titles that I used to define my own identity suddenly pointed me out as a fraud. In my mind, I was a failed mother, which was the worst form of guilt and shame that I could ever imagine. And I was so confused because I loved my son so much and never imagined that he would leave in the way that he did. In my mind, we were close, and he knew how much I loved him. After all, I told him all the time how much I loved him, and he told me that he loved me too. So the world and my whole structure of reality no longer made any sense, and I was in real psychological trouble. I wasn't suicidal, but I really had no real care on whether I woke up on any given morning. In the days and weeks following Todd's death, and now I don't even really use the word death, but I'll explain more of why that is later. I prefer the word transition. I experienced a precious few lucid dreams that to me felt like visitations. The most notable one was the first one, in which Todd vividly stood in front of me and stated that I could not have prevented his death. And the visit had a really odd sensation of a complete absence of emotion, both coming from Todd as well as in my own body, which may have been necessary for it even to have occurred. It was just a very matter-of-fact statement, and then it was over. He was gone. The very next day, my sister Deborah came to check in on me and proceeded to tell me of a dream that her daughter Annabelle had had of Todd a few days earlier. And she described in detail the exact same dream that I had had the night before, even down to the detail of the missing sense of emotion. And I was so astonished that I couldn't even tell my sister Deborah of the synchronicity of the dream. I just listened. And then on another occasion, several months later, I was alone at the family farm in Texas where Todd is buried. And I was sleeping upstairs in one of the cabins that we had built for overnight stays. And Todd came to me in a dream, and he told me how sorry he was for the pain that he had caused to all of the people who loved him. And again, it was very matter of fact. And then he was gone. And I had to ask myself, could these experiences be based in any kind of reality outside of my own dreams and imagination? Was this a form of contact with my son? Was he really trying to relieve my guilt and my grief? Or was it just my own psyche trying to survive an unbearable loss? Six months after Todd's funeral, my father contacted all of his children, all 9 of us, to inform us that he had developed advanced stage prostate cancer and that his life expectancy was limited to a few months. He had chosen not to pursue any treatment. So of his 9 children, I went home to Texas to serve as his primary caretaker for the last 3 months of his life. He may not have realized it at the time, but by allowing me to assist him through his own transition, he provided me with a great gift. I was able to say to him all of the things I wished I had been able to say to Todd. How much I loved him, and how important he was in my life. Not that I didn't say those things to Todd. I just didn't know that they were the last time I would have said them at the time that I did. My father and I talked about all of the meaningful elements of human life and how those things colored our perceptions and our experience. I was able to watch my father as he began to let go of his reality and move into another. And it's important to note, we had all left the Mormon church at this point in our lives. And ultimately, I was able to hold his hand and catch his last breath as he had instructed me to do. I told him what a good job he had done, and then retreated to the family farm as soon as I was no longer needed. There were a number of astonishing things my dad related in his last couple of days of lucidity. But two of the most meaningful for me were when he seemed to interact with Todd. In one instance, he was talking with me and one of my sisters when he looked off into the distance, and he pointed his finger and he asked, "Is that Todd standing on a plane?" And I was so surprised. I simply said, "I don't know, Dad, but I sure hope so." And I kind of wish now, in hindsight, that I had asked him, did he mean a plane like an airplane, or did he mean a plane like a plane of land, you know? Not that it probably really mattered. I just kind of wish I had a better visual. And on the next occasion, he had just woken up from sleep. My father had just woken up from sleep. He had been moved into a hospital bed, oops, I'm sorry. And I was sleeping on his king size bed right next to him. And he opened his eyes and he said, "You're not Tom." And because I have a younger brother named Tom. And I said, "No, I'm not Tom." And he said, "No, I don't mean Tom." He said, I mean Todd." And I said, "No, I'm not Todd." And he said, "I was just talking to Todd in the celestial room." And I said, "Well, I sure hope so." So my father, and the time that I spent with him in those last few months, was a great final gift of, again, just a bit of hope that Todd was there because I was talking to him in the hopes that he would come and get my father. And I believe that he did. So these experiences left me asking those perennial questions that mankind has been asking for millennia. I had an urgent need to know. Those questions that we've been asking: who are we? Do we survive death? Where are we from? And I have discovered not everybody needs to know these things. Not everybody has the urgent need. I do. I've kind of been asking these things my whole life. A lot of people do, but with the loss of my son especially, it became urgent. With my father, it certainly was still important, but I felt like I was beginning to get a sense. My husband doesn't need to know. He's very supportive of me, but he doesn't have that same need to know. I have a lot of other friends and family members who don't have that need to know. But I find there's lots of people in this world that do. I came at this from a lot of different directions. Being an artist by trade, I tend to look at the world from a holistic viewpoint. In my work, I endeavor to bring a vast array of unrelated parts together into a cohesive, logical, meaningful whole. So if I was going to make sense of the upended world that I found myself in, it was going to have to make sense, or at least have a weight of believable evidence from a wide range of sources and perspectives. And where possible, I considered firsthand experience to be ideal. I was on a mission to read everything I could find in every field I could think of that dealt with the basic ideas of reality, consciousness, and existence. I didn't know what I was looking for exactly. I was just looking for overlap of agreement from many fields of study, ideas and philosophies that would create for me an overarching view of something that might feel cohesive, whole, and true. So from there, or rather from here, I'll go into a really truncated list of some of the subjects, practices, and thinkers that have helped me to rebuild a more refined and less fragile sense of self and the nature of my relationship with those I love and the world and people around me. It's far from perfect. I am still human and very flawed. My understanding is limited by many things, but there is a centering and a peace that I have found by gaining a better perspective on the connectedness of all things, and by gaining a solid evidence-based conviction that we are far more than the sum of our physical material parts. The fact that I entertained many ideas does not necessarily mean that I accepted. The first thing that helped me the most initially was meditation. And the very first thing it gave me was a bit of respite from the intense emotions that I was feeling. And that's the reason I stuck with it early on, was because I needed a break from the grief. It also, very on, gave me the sense that I was beginning to have conversations with my son. Conversations that didn't just feel like my own imagination, because they felt like they were in his voice, using his words. I also began to feel like I was having energetic sensations in my body that didn't feel like they belonged necessarily. They didn't feel normal, is the best way I know how to describe it. You know, they were tingling sensations, they were chills, they were, in the case of a really deep state of meditation, really heavy vibrational experiences that were startling. So when I say firsthand experiences are ideal, that was a firsthand experience that was startling. And then I began to receive information that I couldn't know. I have a couple of quick examples of that. And so I'm not going to be talking about things in very chronological order, but because we're talking about a 10-year time span now. But in one case, before I actually before I took on the role of calling myself a medium, and I was studying mediumship, I was just starting to take a weekend mediumship class when I was in Austin, Texas. And it was the very first class I was going to take. It was just a one-day Saturday class, and I decided I would meditate right before this class. When I was in this meditation, I very surprisingly had this quick visual of a very tall man wearing lederhosen, you know, like a German kind of little shorts, you know, lederhosen type outfit, playing the piano and trying to make me laugh. The most unusual image. It was very brief. I wrote it down in my journal. Didn't have a clue what I was supposed to do with this. A really strange image, but I made a note of it. I went to this class, happened to sit next to this very tiny little woman, maybe 5'2", kind of dark complexion, dark hair, and very lovely, sweet little lady. And, you know, we visited and started to do some of the exercises together. And at some point, I'm like, I gotta ask this lady if this image that I had means anything to her. As soon as I told her, she said, oh yeah, my grandfather was German. He played the piano and he was in vaudeville. And I couldn't believe it. I just was flabbergasted. I mean, yeah, I was in a mediumship class, but I really never expected that I would receive something that detailed. I think because I didn't believe that I could at that point yet. I really didn't believe that I could. On another instance, again, I was not yet to the point of considering that this was something that could happen. I was a member of a book group. Actually, we had moved at this point to Colorado. I was participating in a book group that was reading the Spirits book. It was the Caritas Spiritist group in Boulder, Colorado. And I had met a gentleman by the name of Malcolm. He was from Great Britain. One day I was meditating, not even thinking about Malcolm at all, but this name popped into my head, and it sounded something like Bertram. And I'm like, Bertram? That's why did this? I mean, it's an unusual name, Bertram. Where did that come from? And I had a sudden impression that Bertram was connected to Malcolm in my book group. Not only was he connected, but he was like a father figure for Malcolm. Not only was he a father figure, but they looked quite a bit alike. And I'm like, well, okay. I jotted this down in my journal real quick, and I wasn't going to see Malcolm for a week or so, so I needed to remember. I jotted it down, and I'm like, okay, this can't possibly be true, but I will dig up the courage to talk to Malcolm the next time I see him and just ask, what harm can it do? I mean, we're in this book group about the spirits book, surely he'll be open to this. And sure enough, I talked to Malcolm the next week, and I said, Malcolm, you're going to think I'm crazy, but do you know anybody with a name like Bertram who's like a father figure for you? And he just thought, just briefly for a moment, and he said, well, no, not Bertram, Bertrand. I'm like, really? I said, that's close enough. And he said, yes, do you know who Bertrand Russell is? And I'm like, yes. Yeah, he's a really famous British philosopher, writer. He said, yes. He said, Bertrand Russell. He said, I was a member of his Committee of 100, who was an anti-nuke protest group back in the 60s. I said, really? And he said, yeah. And I said, was he like a father figure to you? He said, absolutely. He said he was a really important man in my life. And I think of him fondly. And then I was like, well, in my head, I'm like, well, he wasn't related to him, so there's no way he looked anything like him. I'm not going to say that part. I'm just keeping that to myself. And even though I knew who Bertrand Russell was, I didn't have a visual of him in my mind. So I just kept it to myself. And when the book club was over, I ran to my car and I went and I looked up a picture of Bertrand Russell. Here's Bertrand Russell, and here's my friend Malcolm. And I don't know about you, but I nearly fell out of my car because to me they look like they could be father and son, or even almost the same person. So whether or not that message was for Malcolm or for me, I don't know. But I feel like I have had Bertrand Russell pop in on me periodically over the years. And I find him to be a delightful person to pop in on my meditations from time to time. And I'm very grateful to him for that. He was an agnostic in life, by the way. Okay, I've spent way too much time on that. So we're going to buzz through much of the rest of this because I do not want to take up too much time on speaking. But mediumship has also obviously been very significant to me and to my experience. My family ridiculed my fascination in mediumship early on before Todd's passing because I was interested in it before that time, but I could claim to be just an open-minded skeptic at that point. And largely that's what I was. After Todd's death, my early experiences with mediums were very mixed. I didn't know how to necessarily research and find a good medium. I was looking for anybody who could assuage my grief, and some of my experiences were good and some were less than good. Until I came across, by chance, a young woman who really impressed me by the name of Jamie Butler online. And she was channeling another young man who had taken his own life by the name of Eric Medhus on YouTube. And she really got me moving in the direction of looking more deeply at mediumship. And from there, I started looking further into mental mediumship, physical mediumship, things like the skull experiment, which was really impressive, and the work that they did and how they documented it. And then, of course, I furthered my own experience from there. I looked at the intersection of physics and metaphysics quite deeply. of course, we've had people who've spoken quite a bit on physics in this group. So things like the collapse of the wave function and the observer effect were very interesting to me. Some of that work is now over 100 years old. And I find that some of our greatest physicists began to sound very much like metaphysicists. And I found that our quantum physicists were talking about the exact same things that metaphysicists had been talking about, again, for sometimes millennia. And it was really only sometimes the language, the language usage that was different, but the actual content was largely the same. And so I saw a lot of overlap and a lot of continuity between those two topics. I was very interested in brain science and psychology, studies that were done on meditating monks and the levels of brain activity that scientists were amazed that they achieved, they did not think were possible in humans. Of course, studies on ESP and psi abilities, biofeedback studies, how the mind can alter things within the body, how the mind can alter things like random number generators, mind-body connection studies, those kinds of things. Studies on whether or not the brain is a quantum processor. So the brain is a radio versus the producer of consciousness. And I think even Victor had something on terminal lucidity in just this last week's Friday Afterlife report, which I thought was quite interesting, because that's something that I've looked at as well. So again, some of our greatest scientists have considered these exact same things. So these are not new ideas, and they're not something that science denies. It's just materialist science that denies it. Some of our greatest thinkers have been very open to these same ideas. I've been very interested in the mind-body connection and things like the placebo effect. Modern medicine, when we come out with new drugs, they have to do better than the placebo effect. And that's very hard to achieve because the mind is very good at healing the body, and drugs have to do better than that. And I'm sure most of you are familiar with a lot of these thinkers and these writers like Rupert Sheldrake and Joe Dispenza. If you have any questions about these later, please do ask in the question section, because I love talking about them. I looked very deeply into near-death experiences and deathbed experiences. The ones that I have listed, of course, are very current, common ones, kind of best-selling authors currently. The International Association for Near-Death Studies is just an endless source for information. YouTube, one of my favorite sources just for listening to firsthand accounts. Hospice nurses are an absolute wonderful resource for this kind of information. And then, of course, my own experience with both of my parents, because I also cared for my own mother through her end of life in 2020. My experience with her was very different than with my father. She was more reliant on pain medications, but by that time I was more comfortable with my own mediumship. And with her, I actually had the strong impression that she had left her body before her body had completely finished winding down. It's like the clockwork mechanism of her body had not quite completed, but I was hearing her in my head before that had happened. And that makes sense, because if people can have near-death experiences and return, I think it's very possible for people's body to not quite be done winding down before they leave. Or at least before they mostly leave, even if that cord has not been completely cut yet. I've looked very deeply into out-of-body experiences, astral projection, and lucid dreaming. The names that I have here are just the big names in those areas, and some of the books that they have out. Of course, they have more books than just that. And then, of course, again, my own personal experience in that area. Having studied these, I have a much better understanding of my own lucid dreams. And most people have flying dreams, if not throughout their lives, at least as children, very often. And I did quite a lot. Also, sleep paralysis, you can get a much better understanding of. I had a lot of sleep paralysis as a kid, which can be very scary. And I have made it out of body several times. I never got very far, but far enough that it's very validating for the perspective that I have on things now. I have delved deeply into hypnosis, past life regression, and reincarnation, or what I really prefer to say, multiple incarnations is my preferred word for that. And again, I'll just say that here's kind of the list of big names in that area. I also, once again, love YouTube. If you like to watch regressions, there's lots of them available there. I have also had a personal quantum healing hypnosis therapy session in which I have experienced 2 other, I'll say past lives, but that's not my preferred word. It's a really interesting experience. And again, if you would like to hear about that and want to ask me about it afterwards, please feel free to do that. Technology-based communication. This group has been wonderful about covering this particular topic. Sonia Rinaldi in particular has, of course, been here. Love her. I really love, if you don't know about Marcello Bacci, I highly recommend you find the documentary on him. He's fantastic because the messages that came through his tube radio were so clear, and in the voices of, I mean, you hear the timbre, the actual voices of the people, that so that their families recognize their voices. And it's not digital, it's a tube radio. So obviously he had mediumistic ability that was required for that to occur. But the documentary that's available on him is really amazing. I highly recommend it. I looked at channelers and channeled books. And again, I won't read out this list, there's no point, but I came to a much better understanding of my own religious background, and now understand the Book of Mormon to be a channeled work. Of course, the Mormon Church doesn't talk about it in those terms, but this little bottom, sketched picture that I have on here is how Joseph Smith translated the Book of Mormon. He used a seer stone, and he stuck his head in a hat and stared at this stone. It's a channeled work. And again, the Mormon Church doesn't talk about it that way, but he was working during a time, this was during a time when the spiritualist movement in the Eastern United States was in its heyday. And so I have a much better understanding now of that history and how all of that occurred. And, he was in there at the time of the Fox sisters, and, all of that was going on at the same time, and in the same places. And so I kind of couch that in very different history now than how I understood it growing up. Anyway, just very interesting. I also looked at mysticism, symbology, archetypes, all of these systems, and the rituals around them. Human beings love ritual. It helps us to set and solidify intention. And I look at it as playing in the matrix, as an act of manifestation, as an artist. Creating meaning through visual symbolism or metaphor is simply a second language for me. It's like speaking Spanish, or my husband using C++ to write a computer language. Working with symbols and archetypes feels natural. And it's much like receiving intuitive visual information mediumistically. To me, it's playing charades. Can't do this work without looking at the energetic body. So of course, that's all part and parcel. Again, I'll just slide past this. It's and then I looked very closely at comparative world religions and cultural beliefs. I don't claim any religion at this stage in my life. I'm spiritual, but not religious. But I am very interested in things like sacred locations, earth energy, ley lines, stone circles. I have visited, that's my photograph, by the way. I have visited this particular stone circle in Scotland and had a very interesting interaction with that center stone. If you want to ask me about it later, I'll be happy to tell you the story. And then finally, I am very grateful that I live in a time when the sharing of information and ideas is so easy and readily accessible. If I had experienced the same life events, even 20 or 30 years in the past, my access to so much research and scholarship and information would have been very different. And I am not sure how well I would have fared by comparison. And I am eternally grateful to this group for being a big part of that journey. Anytime someone asks me for resources or on scientific evidence for the afterlife or any other type of resources, I send them straight to Victor and Wendy's website without, do not pass go, do not collect $200, go straight there, because they can get everything they want and more from there, and then, beyond. So I'm really grateful because that has helped me tremendously as well. And the last thing I have to say is, here is what I have learned from all of that. For me, the evidence is overwhelming and convincing that consciousness is primary, fundamental reality. It permeates and unifies all that is. So that concept of oneness. We are conscious, energetic, spiritual beings that exist beyond and outside of the perceived construct of time and space. Physical earth life is a chosen, holographic, collective conscious experience. Separation is a convincing illusion, and I'm reconvinced of it on a regular basis. I mean, it is a convincing illusion. As embodied spiritual beings, we can learn to communicate with disembodied spiritual beings. Love crosses the boundaries of space, time, and vibrational densities. We choose to experience many incarnations as a method of growth and development, and it's okay to be human because that's what we're here for. Everything else is details. And as many of you know, I just started a Facebook group called The Thinning Veil. Please join me there if you would like to share your stories of interacting with your loved ones who are on the other side.